A daughter, a sister, a nurse, a woman trusted with the lives of the most vulnerable. But inside the sterile walls of Bayou Ridge General Hospital, she wasn't saving lives. She was ending them. And no one saw it coming. No one, except her parents. Sarah Johnson was everything a family could hope for. Smart, kind, devoted to her work. She spent years caring for the sick, earning the trust of doctors, nurses, and grieving families. She was the nurse everyone wanted by their side in times of need. But what happens when the person meant to heal is the one holding the syringe? When compassion is nothing more than a mask? For months, the deaths seemed like nothing more than tragic losses. Infants, fragile and premature, slip away in the dead of night. Parents were devastated and staff were shaken, but nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what they thought. Because these deaths weren't just fate. They weren't just medical complications. They were carefully orchestrated, each one hidden behind a veil of routine hospital procedures. A perfect crime, until it wasn't. A mother's instinct is never wrong. A father's love is unshakable. But what happens when that love is tested in the worst way imaginable? When the very child you raised, the one you nurtured, guided, and protected, is capable of unthinkable horrors. When the phone call you never imagined making becomes the only way to stop the bloodshed. Robert and Linda Johnson faced a decision no parent should ever have to make. Turn a blind eye, pretend it wasn't happening, or make the call that would destroy their family forever. Tonight we uncover the horrifying truth behind a case that shook an entire town, shattered a family, and left the nation questioning, how do you stop a killer when that killer is your child? Stay with us as we expose the story of Sarah Johnson, the trusted nurse with a deadly secret. The truth is far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. And by the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself just one question. Would you have turned her in? Bayou Ridge, Louisiana, a town where time moves slowly, where neighbors greet each other by name, and where trust isn't given, it's assumed. Generations have lived here, built their lives here, and raised their families in a place where safety isn't a question but a certainty. In a town like this, no one locks their doors at night. No one expects danger to lurk just around the corner. But what if the danger isn't outside? What if it's sitting across from you at the dinner table? What if it's tucking you into bed at night? What if the person you love most is the very one you should fear? For Robert and Linda Johnson, life was about doing the right thing. He was a high school principal, a man who believed in structure, discipline, and shaping young minds for a better future. She was a social worker, a woman whose heart was big enough to carry the burdens of an entire community. Together, they were admired and respected, the kind of couple people turn to in times of trouble. But even the strongest, most well-intentioned parents can't see everything. Even they can miss the warning signs. Even they can be blindsided. Their daughter Sarah was the perfect child, the one who never caused trouble, who never strayed from the right path. She was studious and responsible. The girl's parents pointed to her and said, "Why can't you be more like her?" She never skipped class, never stayed out late, never gave them a reason to worry. And when she decided to become a nurse, it felt like fate. Helping people was in her blood. It was what she was meant to do. But looking back, maybe that was the first red flag. Maybe the signs were there all along, hidden in plain sight. Maybe they just didn't want to see them. At Bayou Ridge General Hospital, Sarah was more than a nurse. She was a comfort to grieving families, a steady hand in the chaos of the emergency room, and a kind voice in the darkest moments of a patient's life. She never called in sick and never complained about long shifts. She was always there, always ready, always watching. The people of Bayou Ridge trusted her. They trusted all their healthcare workers, because why wouldn't they? This was a town where doctors still made house calls, and where nurses held your hand when you got bad news. It was a place where the word hospital didn't mean fear, it meant safety. But what happens when that trust is misplaced? When the very person meant to save lives is the one deciding who lives and who doesn't? No one questioned the deaths at first. A premature baby who didn't make it through the night. An elderly man whose heart finally gave out. A young mother who suddenly stopped breathing. Tragic, yes. Suspicious? No. Because death is expected in a hospital. It comes with the territory. People grieve, people move on. And so, the bodies left quietly. Families mourned, funerals were held, and life continued. And Sarah? Sarah showed up to work the next day like nothing happened. She moved through the halls, smiling, reassuring, pretending, and no one, not the doctors, not the nurses, not even her own parents, saw what was really happening. Bayou Ridge was built on trust, but trust is the easiest thing to exploit, and when the truth finally came out, it didn't just shatter a town, it shattered a family. And in the end, the very people who loved Sarah the most would be the ones forced to stop her. Hospitals are places of healing, places where families cling to hope, where doctors fight to turn tragedy into survival. But at Bayou Ridge General, something was happening that no one could explain, something that turned joy into grief, life into loss. It started as a whisper, a quiet concern, a nagging feeling among the staff, but soon that whisper became a question, and that question became a nightmare. In early 2009, something changed at Bayou Ridge General. The neonatal unit, the ward meant to bring new life into the world, became a place of inexplicable sorrow. Babies who were stable, who were expected to go home, were suddenly slipping away. One minute they were breathing, hearts strong, eyes wide open. The next, monitors flatlined, alarms blared, and doctors rushed in. Too late. The numbers didn't lie. The hospital was seeing a spike in infant deaths unlike anything in its history. The staff searched for answers. Was it an undetected infection spreading through the unit? A flaw in the hospital's equipment? A tragic but natural increase in complications? Doctors pored over charts, ran tests, and examined every possible cause, but each time the answer was the same: no explanation. Families grieved, parents wept, but the cause of death always pointed to medical complications. Until one day, it didn't. February 14, 2009. Valentine's Day. A day meant for love, but at Bayou Ridge General, it would be remembered for something else. Baby Noah Montgomery, born 3 weeks early but thriving, was scheduled to go home that morning. His mother Danielle had packed his tiny onesies, his father had already warmed the car, and the nurses had signed off on his discharge papers. But Noah never made it home. Just hours before he was set to leave, he stopped breathing. The code was called. Nurses and doctors swarmed the room doing everything they could to save him, but just like the others before him, Noah was gone. His parents were inconsolable, staff were shaken. Another unexplained loss, another life cut short before it even began. But something about Noah's death felt different. It wasn't just another tragedy, it was a turning point. Noah had been perfectly healthy, too healthy to die without warning. And there was one more thing that didn't sit right with the nurses on duty that night. Moments before Noah crashed, they saw something. Someone. A figure leaving his room, moving quickly, quietly. A nurse, dressed in blue scrubs, walked away as the monitors blared behind her. For months, she had been the comforting hand on the shoulder of grieving parents, the one who wiped tears and whispered, "I'm so sorry." But now, for the first time, someone was looking at her differently. Someone was asking a question they never dared to ask before. Had Sarah been there every time? The thought alone was unbearable. No one wanted to believe it. No one wanted to suspect the nurse who had spent years building her reputation as the most compassionate in the hospital. But as the days passed, another thought began to take hold, one that couldn't be ignored. What if these weren't just tragic coincidences? What if these babies didn't just die? What if someone was choosing when their tiny hearts would stop beating? When a hospital loses a patient, it's a tragedy. When it loses multiple patients under the same circumstances, it's a crisis. But when the losses start forming a pattern, one that points to a single individual, everything changes. Bayou Ridge General was a pillar of the community, a place of comfort in times of distress. It was where families welcomed new life, where the sick found care, and where doctors and nurses were seen as heroes. So, when whispers of an investigation began circulating within the hospital's administration, it was done in complete secrecy. No press releases, no statements, no warnings. The people of Bayou Ridge continued placing their trust in the facility, in the staff, in the hands that cared for them. But behind closed doors, those very hands were now under scrutiny. It started small. A quiet meeting between senior staff, a review of the numbers, a second look at reports that had been filed away without much thought. The deaths were tragic, yes, but were they unnatural? The answer wasn't clear at first. Each case on its own seemed like an unfortunate loss, something that could be explained by a pre-existing condition, an unforeseen complication. But when viewed together, side by side, the deaths told a different story, and one name showed up in nearly every case. A nurse with an impeccable record, a woman praised for her compassion, her dedication, the last person anyone would suspect. And yet the numbers didn't lie. A pattern had emerged, a pattern that raised questions no one wanted to ask. It was a veteran nurse, Margaret Hayes, who made the first call to hospital authorities. She had been in the profession for over 30 years. She had seen everything: complications, miracles, loss, but something about these deaths didn't sit right with her. And one detail stood out more than any other: the timing. The babies who passed away, they all died on Sarah's shift. It was impossible to ignore. Margaret's hands shook as she wrote down the dates, as she traced the numbers over and over, as she whispered to herself, "It can't be, it just can't be." But the facts were in front of her. Sarah had been present for every loss, and as Margaret dug deeper, she found something even more disturbing. Each of these infants, healthy, stable, on the verge of discharge, died suddenly, without warning, without explanation. Margaret brought her concerns forward, but a gut feeling wasn't enough. The hospital needed more than suspicions. They needed proof. So, an internal audit was launched. Every patient file, every chart, and every dosage administered during Sarah's shifts was reviewed with a new level of scrutiny. And then, they found it. Discrepancies. Inconsistent dosages. Medication logs that didn't add up. And one discovery that changed everything: insulin. Unexplained, undocumented insulin in the bloodstreams of multiple deceased infants. A substance that, in the wrong hands, could turn a heartbeat into silence. A weapon disguised as medicine. But how was it getting into their systems? Who was administering it? The answer was becoming clearer by the second. Sarah had access, Sarah was present, Sarah was the common thread. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. The hospital needed something more concrete, something undeniable. And so they turned to the one thing that never lies: surveillance footage. The cameras at Bayou Ridge weren't meant to catch criminals. They were meant for security, for patient safety, for monitoring high-risk areas. But as investigators combed through weeks of footage, pausing, rewinding, watching again and again, what they found made their blood run cold. Sarah moving through the halls with the ease of someone who belonged, slipping into rooms where she wasn't assigned, accessing medicine cabinets without authorization, pausing by incubators, looking around before leaning in close, and then, walking away. Moments later the alarms would sound. It was no longer just suspicion. It was no longer just a theory. The pieces had fallen into place, and now the question was no longer, could it be Sarah, but how many lives had she already taken? Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some truths are too unbearable to face. And sometimes, the people we trust the most, the ones we love, the ones we raise, are capable of things beyond our worst nightmares. Robert and Linda Johnson had spent their entire lives building a family based on love, discipline, and respect. They raised their daughter Sarah to be kind, to be compassionate, to dedicate her life to helping others. She had done just that. At least, that's what they believed. But one discovery would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew about their child. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. A quiet visit, a normal day. Robert and Linda had stopped by Sarah's home, as they often did, bringing homemade food, sitting in the living room, and catching up on her life. It was a routine, a comfort, but that day something was different. Linda had gone into Sarah's childhood bedroom, a place filled with memories, yearbooks, trophies, stuffed animals from birthdays long past. It was a moment of nostalgia until she saw it. A small, leather-bound journal, wedged between two books on a dusty shelf. It wasn't the journal itself that caught Linda's eye. It was the way it was placed, hidden just enough to be forgotten but still within reach, as if waiting to be found. Curious, she picked it up, flipped through the pages, and what she saw made her hands tremble. There were words scrawled across the paper. Thoughts, confessions, reflections that made no sense at first, but as Linda read further, the pieces began to fit together. Entries describing moments of control, pages filled with cryptic messages about deciding fates. And then, a single line that sent a cold shock through her body. Life is fragile. It only takes a little push. Her heart pounded. This wasn't the diary of a hopeful young girl. This wasn't the journal of a dedicated nurse. This was something else, something unexplainable, something terrifying. Linda called for Robert. Her voice shook. He entered the room, confused, until he saw the look on his wife's face. She handed him the journal without a word, and as he read, his expression shifted, from confusion to disbelief, from disbelief to horror. There were dates, names, subtle references to patients, to their conditions, to their deaths. Playing God is easy when no one suspects you, one entry read. Another, they trust me, they never ask questions, they never see it coming. It was impossible. This wasn't their daughter, this wasn't Sarah. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe it was fiction, maybe it was something she wrote for herself. An outlet, a dark fantasy, nothing more. But the more they read, the harder it became to deny. And then, they found the final entry. I thought I would feel something, guilt, sadness, regret. But there was nothing. Only silence. And silence is beautiful. Robert felt his stomach turn. His fingers gripped the edges of the journal so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He looked at Linda. Her face was pale. Her breath came in shallow gasps. And in that moment, without saying a word, they both knew the truth. Their daughter wasn't who they thought she was. Sarah came home later that evening, completely unaware that her world had just changed. She walked through the door, smiling, setting her bag down, expecting nothing more than another evening with her parents. But as she sat down across from them, she noticed it. The way they looked at her. The fear in their eyes. The journal is on the table between them. What is this, Sarah? Robert's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something breaking. Sarah's eyes flickered to the book, then back to them. For a moment she said nothing. Then, a small laugh. Dismissive. Are you serious? You think I actually meant any of that? She rolled her eyes, shaking her head. It's just writing. I was going through a dark time, you're overreacting. But Linda wasn't convinced. Her mother's intuition screamed at her. Sarah, these aren't just stories. These are real cases, real people. Their names are here. Their deaths are here. Sarah's expression remained unreadable. But there was a shift, a flicker of something behind her eyes. For a split second, she looked amused. And then she sighed, shaking her head again. You really think I'd be stupid enough to write something incriminating? Please. He stood up. If you're done playing detective, I have an early shift tomorrow. And just like that, the conversation was over. Or at least, that's what Sarah thought. Robert and Linda didn't sleep that night. They sat in the dark, staring at the journal, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of what they had found. But no matter how many times they read the words, the meaning never changes. Their daughter was hiding something, something terrible. And if they were right, if even a fraction of what was written in those pages was true, then more lives were at risk. Robert had spent years shaping young minds, teaching them about responsibility, about doing the right thing. Linda had spent her life helping those in need, offering support to families in crisis. But now, they were the ones facing an impossible decision. If they were wrong, they would be destroying their daughter's life. But if they were right, if they did nothing, they would be complicit in something unforgivable. The sun rose, a new day, but nothing felt the same. They had to make a choice, and in the end there was only one answer. And dropping hands, Robert picked up the phone and dialed the police. The truth had been uncovered, the evidence was undeniable, and now, there was no turning back. Robert Johnson's hands trembled as he ended the call. Linda sat beside him, staring blankly at the journal still open on the coffee table. It felt surreal. Just hours ago, their daughter had stood before them, dismissing their concerns, acting as though everything was fine. But nothing was fine. Nothing had been fine for a long time. And now, they were waiting for the moment that would change their lives forever. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, red and blue lights, the low hum of engines, the sharp knock at the door. Sarah had just woken up when she heard it. She stepped into the hallway, rubbing her eyes, confused, and then she saw them, officers, standing in the living room, speaking in hushed voices to her parents. And the look on Robert's face told her everything she needed to know. "Sarah Johnson, you're under arrest." She didn't resist. She didn't scream. She didn't even ask why. She simply stared, as if she had been expecting this, as if she had always known it would come to this. Handcuffs clicked into place. The officers guided her outside. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching, whispering. The town that once trusted her, the town that once admired her, now saw her for what she truly was. And just like that, she was gone. The investigation that followed was meticulous, exhaustive. Detectives pored over medical records, surveillance footage, and patient histories. It was no longer just suspicion. It was fact. The pattern was there, undeniable and horrifying. The infants who had died, they hadn't been victims of medical complications. They hadn't been lost to tragic accidents. They had been taken, silently, methodically, by someone they were supposed to be safe with. Sarah was questioned for hours. At first she denied everything, claimed the journal was fiction, a way to cope with stress, but then something changed. She leaned forward, smiled, just a little, and asked a question that sent a cold wave through the room. "How many do you think there were?" The room fell silent. The lead detective shifted uncomfortably, and then, without a hint of remorse, Sarah spoke. She told them about the insulin. The doses were so small, so untraceable that no one would have questioned it. The way she would stand by, watching as life slipped away. Her face the last thing those innocent eyes would see. She didn't cry. She didn't plead for mercy. She simply explained, as if it were all just another day at work. The prosecution had more than enough. Sarah Johnson was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat in silence, their grief palpable, their anger restrained only by the walls around them. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict? Guilty. She showed no emotion when the sentence was read. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. She would never walk free again. She would never touch another patient. She would never hold another life in her hands. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps, in sobs, in the weight of justice finally being served. But for Robert and Linda Johnson, there was no victory in this outcome. No relief. No sense of closure. They had done the right thing. They had stopped her before more innocent lives were lost. But at what cost? They might have turned in their daughter. The town of Bayou Ridge would never be the same. The hospital tightened its protocols, ensuring that no one could abuse their power the way Sarah had. Nationwide hospitals took notice, implementing stricter monitoring, revisiting security measures, and questioning the very trust they placed in their staff. The world had changed because of what had happened here, because of what Sarah had done. As for Robert and Linda, they disappeared from the public eye, moved away, started over. But how do you start over when your past is something you can never escape? When your child, the one you raised, the one you loved, is remembered not as a healer, but as a killer. To this day, Sarah Johnson remains behind bars. She doesn't speak to the media. She doesn't appeal her sentence. She simply exists, unmoved, unapologetic, and when asked if she regrets what she's done, she offers only one response. A slow, measured smile. The kind of smile you never forget. Trust is a fragile thing. We give it freely, to doctors, to nurses, to the people sworn to care for us and our loved ones. But what happens when that trust is shattered? When the very person meant to save lives is the one taking them? The events that unfolded in Bayou Ridge are more than just a crime story. They are a sobering reminder that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles, it comforts, it pretends to heal. The Johnsons will forever be known as the parents who turned in their own daughter. The town of Bayou Ridge will always remember the innocent lives lost. And Sarah Johnson? She will spend the rest of her days behind bars, her name forever linked to the unimaginable betrayals hidden within hospital walls. But the question remains, how many more Sarahs are out there? How many lives have been quietly stolen by those we trust the most? And more importantly, would we even see them coming? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Could this have been prevented? Should the hospital have noticed the warning signs sooner? We want to hear from you. If you found this story compelling, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We have more stories coming. Stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Stories that make you question everything you thought you knew. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are hiding in plain sight.